July 5th, 1950. Dawn. A ridgeline near Osan, South Korea. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bradford Smith counted 8 T-34 tanks through his binoculars, then 10, then stopped counting because his hands started shaking. The tanks rolled south on the main highway 3 miles away, their engines loud enough to hear from the ridge. Behind them came trucks, at least 30, packed with infantry. Behind the trucks, more tanks. The column stretched north as far as Smith could see through the morning haze. Smith lowered the binoculars. His executive officer, Major Floyd Martin, stood beside him staring at the same highway. Martin's face showed what Smith was thinking. This was not an advance element. This was not a few tanks and some infantry. This was a mechanized assault column, and it was heading straight toward them. 4 days earlier, Smith had been told he would face maybe a regiment of poorly equipped North Korean soldiers. Intelligence said they had minimal armor, a few light tanks at most. Nothing American weapons could not handle. Smith raised the binoculars again and counted. 33 tanks, all T-34s, Soviet heavy armor, the kind that had rolled through Eastern Europe and crushed German positions. His men had rocket launchers designed for light vehicles. Against T-34 armor, those rockets would bounce off like thrown stones. "Sir," Martin's voice was quiet. "What are your orders?" Smith did not answer immediately. He was thinking about what he had told his men 4 days ago. July 1st, 1950. Camp Wood, Japan. Smith had been in his quarters at Itazuki Air Base when the teletype arrived. He read it standing at his desk with the window open, warm evening air coming in from the airfield. Proceed immediately to Korea. Establish blocking position north of Busan. Delay North Korean advance. Smith was 34 years old. He had fought in the Pacific during World War II. He had commanded 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment for 8 months. His men had been occupation troops in Japan for the past year. Comfortable duty, regular meals, soft billets. Now they were going to war. Smith read the orders again. His wife had written him 2 weeks ago. Their son had turned 6. She asked when he would rotate home. He had written back saying maybe by Christmas. Now he was not certain. He called for Major Martin and showed him the orders. Martin read them and looked up. How many men? A reinforced company, 540, fast and mobile. Against how many North Koreans? Smith had already asked headquarters that question. Intelligence says we will encounter an advance element, probably a regiment, maybe less. They have been moving fast, which means they are overextended. Martin looked skeptical. What kind of equipment? Mostly small arms, some mortars, a few tanks, but nothing heavy. And what exactly are we supposed to do with 500 men against a regiment? Delay them. Hit them hard enough to make them pause. Buy a week for the main force to deploy. Smith paused. The brass thinks when the North Koreans see Americans, they will stop. Maybe negotiate. Apparently, they are not expecting us. Martin said nothing. Smith did not blame him for doubting, but orders were orders. Smith spent the rest of the evening selecting men. He chose soldiers who had been in Japan longest, men who knew their weapons and could follow orders under pressure. By midnight, he had his roster: 406 infantry, 134 artillery. The next morning, he briefed them in the mess hall. The men sat on benches looking young and uncertain. Private Donald Yasmin sat in the 3rd row. He was 19 years old, from Nebraska. He had joined the army because the farm could not support his family. He wrote his mother every week and told her Japan duty was boring but safe. Tomorrow he would write about going to Korea. He planned to make it sound routine. Smith stood at the front of the hall. North Korea invaded South Korea 6 days ago. The South Korean army is retreating. We are going to establish a defensive position and delay the North Korean advance until reinforcements arrive. A soldier in the back raised his hand. "Sir, how big is the force we will be facing?" "Intelligence estimates an advance element, maybe a regiment. They have been moving fast, so they are probably overextended. Our job is to hit them hard enough to make them pause." Another soldier spoke up. "What kind of tanks do they have?" Smith repeated what headquarters had told him. "A few light tanks, nothing our weapons cannot handle." The men relaxed slightly. The mission sounded manageable. Hold a position. Stop an overextended force. Wait for help. Smith dismissed the briefing and returned to his quarters. He tried to sleep but could not. 540 men, 4 howitzers, a dozen rocket launchers. He kept telling himself it was enough. The North Koreans were advancing too fast. They had to be running low on supplies. American presence would have a psychological effect. They would see U.S. forces and pause. He had to believe that, because the alternative was unacceptable. The next morning, Task Force Smith boarded transport aircraft and flew to Korea. They landed at Pusan and moved north by truck convoy. The roads were crowded with refugees heading south. Thousands of civilians walking, carrying children, pushing carts loaded with belongings. Smith sat in the lead jeep watching them pass. An old woman walked beside the road holding a small girl by the hand. The girl looked maybe 6 years old, the same age as Smith's son. The woman saw the American convoy and stopped. She bowed slightly. The girl just stared. Smith thought about his son back home, safe, fed, playing in the yard while his mother hung laundry. Smith had written her that he was going to Korea on a routine mission. He had not mentioned that he was taking 540 men to stop an army. The convoy reached Osan on July 4th. Smith walked the ridgeline he had selected from the map. The position looked good. The ridge was 300 feet high. The highway ran straight north for miles. Clear fields of fire. Any force approaching from the north would have to come up the road in full view. Smith positioned his men along the ridge in a line 1 mile long. He placed the howitzers behind the ridge where they could fire over the infantry. He positioned anti-tank teams at key points with clear shots at the highway. Each team had 2 rocket launchers. The weapons were effective against light armor at close range. By evening, the men were in position. They dug foxholes and set up firing lines. Some joked about finally seeing action. Private Jasmine wrote a letter to his mother by flashlight. He told her they were in a good position. He told her not to worry. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket to mail later. Smith spent the night at his command post behind the ridge. Martin tried to establish radio communication with headquarters, but the terrain made it difficult. The radio crackled with static. Martin kept adjusting frequencies but could not get a clear signal. "Keep trying," Smith said. "We need updates on enemy movement." Martin nodded and continued working. Smith looked at his watch. 2,200 hours. No sign of North Korean forces. Maybe intelligence was right. Maybe they had stopped to consolidate. Smith tried to sleep but kept waking. He kept thinking about the briefing. A few tanks. Nothing we cannot handle. He had believed it when he said it. His men believed it. Now he lay in the dark, hoping it was true. At 3 a.m, Smith heard engines, distant, from the north. He stepped outside and listened. The sound was getting louder. Multiple vehicles, tracked vehicles. He walked to the forward observation post. The soldier on watch was looking north through binoculars. "Sir, engines, coming this way. Cannot see them yet. Wake everyone. Get them in position." The word passed down the line. Men climbed into foxholes and checked weapons. Artillery crews prepared guns. Anti-tank teams loaded launchers. Everyone waited. Dawn broke at 5:30. The sky lightened from the black to gray. Smith stood at the observation post with binoculars, scanning north. At first he saw nothing, then movement. Vehicles on the road, coming south. Smith focused the binoculars. Trucks, 30 at least. Behind them something larger, moving slower. He adjusted focus and felt his stomach drop. Tanks, T-34s, not a few, not light armor. Heavy Soviet tanks, 8, 10, 15. More kept appearing. The column was massive. 30 trucks packed with infantry, 33 tanks. More vehicles behind them stretching into the distance. Smith thought about Private Jasmine and the letter in his pocket. He thought about the briefing 4 days ago. A few tanks, nothing we cannot handle. He thought about his son back home, 6 years old, safe. Major Martin stood beside him waiting for orders. Smith had no orders for this. 540 men with light weapons facing 33 T-34 tanks and thousands of mechanized infantry. Intelligence had been completely wrong. The tanks kept coming south. Unstoppable. Inevitable. Smith lowered the binoculars and looked at his men along the ridge. They could not see the full column yet. They were still confident, still believed what he had told them. In 15 minutes, they would see the truth. The tanks did not stop. They rolled south down the highway at a steady 10 miles per hour, their engines making a sound like continuous thunder. Smith watched through binoculars as the lead tank passed a burned-out village 2 miles away. Behind it, The column stretched back over a mile. 33 tanks, 30 trucks, thousands of infantry. Smith lowered the binoculars and turned to his artillery commander, Lieutenant Colonel Miller Perry. "Can the howitzers penetrate that armor?" Perry had been watching the column with his own binoculars. "No, sir. The 105 millimeter might damage tracks or disable external components, but penetrate the hull? Not at this range." "What about direct fire at close range?" "Maybe, if we get lucky and hit a weak point, but the T-34 frontal armor is thick. We would need multiple hits." Smith nodded. He had expected that answer but needed to hear it confirmed. He turned to Captain Richard Dashner, his heavy weapons officer. "What about the rocket launchers?" Dashner looked uncomfortable. "Sir, the 2.36-inch launcher was designed for light vehicles and bunkers. Against T-34 armor, I cannot guarantee penetration. We would need to hit the side or rear at close range, maybe 100 yards or less. And if they fire at us first? Then we are shooting back from concealed positions while taking direct tank fire." Smith was quiet. The mathematics were simple. His men had weapons that might work at close range if they got lucky. The tanks had main guns that could hit his positions from 2,000 yards with high explosive shells. The T-34 carried a 76 millimeter main gun. One hit would destroy a foxhole and kill everyone in it. Major Martin stood beside Smith, watching the column approach. "Sir, we should report this to headquarters." Smith agreed. He walked to the command post where the radio operator was still trying to establish communication. The radio crackled with static and broken transmissions. The operator adjusted frequencies and called again. "Badger 6, this is Task Force Smith. Over." Static. "Badger 6, this is Task Force Smith. Do you read? Over." More static. Then a faint voice. "Task Force Smith, this is Badger 6. Read you broken and distorted. Send message. Over." The operator handed Smith the microphone. Smith pressed the transmit button. "Badger 6, we have enemy column in sight. 3 T-34 tanks, approximately 30 trucks with infantry, moving south on main highway toward our position. Request instructions. Over." There was a long pause. Then the voice came back, still faint. "Task Force Smith, say again tank count. Over." 3. Repeat. 3 T-34 tanks. Over." Another pause. Longer this time. Then, "Task Force Smith, confirm you are in prepared defensive position. Over." "Affirmative. Defensive position established north of Osan. Enemy column now at 2 miles and closing. Over." "Task Force Smith, maintain position. Engage enemy. Delay advance. Main force deploying to your location. Estimate 6 hours. Acknowledge. Over." Smith looked at Major Martin. 6 hours. The order was clear. Hold for 6 hours. Buy time for the main force. Smith pressed the transmit button. "Badger 6, acknowledge order to maintain position and engage. Request immediate air support and artillery support. Over." Static. Then, "Task Force Smith, air support requested. No artillery available your sector. You are forward element. Maintain position. Out." The transmission ended. Smith handed the microphone back to the operator and walked outside. The tanks were now 1.5 miles away, clearly visible without binoculars. He could see the lead tank's main gun traversing slightly as it scanned the terrain ahead. Martin followed him out. "Sir, they told us to hold." "I heard." "For 6 hours?" "Yes." Martin was quiet for a moment. "Sir, we do not have the weapons to stop 33 tanks." Smith knew that, but the order had been clear. Maintain position. Engage enemy. Delay advance. Those were lawful orders from a superior officer. Smith had 2 choices: obey the order and fight with inadequate weapons, or refuse the order and retreat without engaging. Refusing a direct order during combat was not an option. Courts-martial aside, Smith had been sent here for a specific purpose: delay the North Korean advance. If he retreated without fighting, the entire mission failed. The main force needed time to deploy. Task Force Smith was buying that time. Smith made his decision. "We will engage when they reach effective range. Artillery targets the trucks and infantry. Anti-tank teams target the tanks at closest possible range. Infantry provides covering fire. We hold as long as we can, then withdraw south under covering fire." Martin nodded. "Yes, sir." Smith walked the line one more time, checking positions. The men were tense but ready. Private Jasmine crouched in his foxhole, holding his rifle, watching the tanks approach. Smith stopped near his position. "You all right, Private?" Jasmine looked up. "Yes, sir. Those are bigger tanks than we were expecting." "Yes, they are." "Will our rockets work on them?" Smith could have lied, could have said yes to boost morale, but Jasmine deserved the truth. "At close range, maybe. We will have to see." Jasmine nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Smith moved on. He passed other positions where men asked similar questions. "Will the rockets work? How many tanks are there?" "When is air support coming?" Smith answered honestly. "Maybe." 33. Requested but not confirmed. He returned to the command post and climbed to the observation position on top of the ridge. From there, he could see the full battlefield. His men along the ridge in a thin line, the highway stretching north, the column approaching from the north, massive and unstoppable. The lead tank reached 1 mile from the ridge. Smith watched it through binoculars. The tank commander was visible in the turret hatch, scanning ahead with his own binoculars. He was looking directly at the ridge where Smith's men were positioned. The North Koreans knew Americans were here. They were not stopping. They were not slowing down. They were advancing. Lieutenant Perry appeared beside Smith. "Sir, we have the lead tank in range. Request permission to fire." Smith looked at the column. If they fired now, they would reveal their positions. The tanks would return fire with main guns and high-explosive shells. But if they waited until the column was closer, the tanks would have less time to react before coming into range of the anti-tank weapons. Smith made the decision. "Hold fire until the lead tank reaches 800 yards, then target the trucks and infantry. Avoid the tanks until they are closer." Perry nodded and returned to his position. Smith watched the column advance. The lead tank passed the 1-mile marker. 900 yards, 800 yards. Perry gave the command. The 4 howitzers fired simultaneously. The sound was massive. 4 shells arced over the ridge and descended toward the column. Smith watched through binoculars. 2 shells landed near the trucks. 1 hit directly. The truck exploded, and men scattered. The other 2 shells landed on the road between vehicles, sending up fountains of dirt, but causing no visible damage. The column stopped. The tanks halted. The trucks behind them stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing moved. Smith thought maybe the artillery had worked. Maybe the psychological effect of American fire would make them pause, reconsider, negotiate. Then the lead tank's turret rotated toward the ridge. The main gun elevated slightly. Smith saw the muzzle flash before he heard the sound. The shell hit the ridge 200 yards to his left. The explosion was enormous. Dirt and rock flew into the air. A second tank fired, then a third. The ridge erupted with incoming fire. Smith dropped below the ridgeline as shells impacted all along the American position. He heard men shouting. The howitzers fired again, but now the tanks were firing back continuously. High explosive shells hit the ridge in a rolling barrage. 1 shell hit near an artillery position. Smith heard the explosion and then screaming. He crawled to the edge and looked over. The tanks were moving again, not retreating, advancing. They rolled forward, firing their main guns as they came. The trucks behind them dispersed off the road, and infantry dismounted. Thousands of soldiers spread out on both sides of the highway, forming assault lines. The tanks reached 600 yards. Smith heard the crack of anti-tank rockets launching. He saw 2 rockets streak toward the lead tank. Both hit. One bounced off the frontal armor and tumbled away. The other hit the turret and detonated. Smoke obscured the tank for a moment. When it cleared, the tank was still moving. A black scorch mark on the turret was the only visible damage. More rockets fired. One hit a tank in the side and penetrated. The tank stopped, and smoke poured from the hatches. Crew members climbed out and ran, but that was 1 tank. 32 kept coming. The tanks reached 400 yards. Their fire was accurate now. Shells landed directly on American positions. Smith saw a foxhole take a direct hit. The men inside disappeared in the explosion. Another shell hit an artillery position. The howitzer flipped over and the crew scattered. Smith's radio operator called to him. "Sir, Badger 6 is calling." Smith crawled to the radio. The operator handed him the microphone. Smith pressed transmit. "Badger 6, this is Task Force Smith. Over." "Task Force Smith, what is your situation? Over." "We are engaged. Estimate 3-2 tanks still operational. Heavy infantry assault, taking casualties. Anti-tank weapons ineffective against frontal armor. Request immediate support. Over. Task Force Smith. Air support en route. Estimate 15 minutes. Continue delaying action. Over. 15 minutes. Smith looked at the battlefield. The tanks were now 300 yards away. Infantry was advancing behind them in waves. His anti-tank teams were firing, but the rockets either bounced off or caused minimal damage. The howitzers were trying to target infantry, but tanks were destroying the gun positions one by one. Smith pressed transmit. Badger 6. Recommend we withdraw to secondary position. Current position untenable. Over. There was a pause. Then, Task Force Smith. Maintain position as long as possible. Every minute counts. Acknowledge. Over. Smith looked at Major Martin. Martin's face was pale. Men were dying. Equipment was being destroyed. The tanks were 200 yards away now. In 2 more minutes, they would roll over the ridge and destroy everything. Smith pressed transmit. Acknowledged. Out. He put down the microphone and turned to Martin. Prepare to withdraw. When I give the order, fall back by squads to the secondary position 1 mile south, covering fire from remaining artillery. Martin nodded and moved to relay the orders. Smith looked over the ridge one more time. The tanks were 150 yards away. Infantry was 50 yards behind the tanks. His men were still firing, but the incoming fire was overwhelming. He saw Private Jaceman in his foxhole. Jaceman was loading his rifle and firing, then ducking as shells impacted around him. A tank shell hit 20 yards from Jaceman's position. The explosion threw dirt and rock over the foxhole. Jaceman kept firing. Smith wanted to order the withdrawal immediately. Wanted to save Jaceman and the others, but the order had been clear. Hold as long as possible. Every minute counts. Smith waited. The tanks reached 100 yards. His anti-tank teams fired their last rockets. One tank took a hit in the tracks and stopped. The others kept coming. Infantry reached 50 yards from the base of the ridge and began climbing. Smith gave the order. All units withdraw. Fall back to secondary position. The word passed down the line. Men climbed out of foxholes and ran south down the backside of the ridge. The remaining howitzer fired one last time. Then the crew abandoned the gun and ran. Smith and Martin were the last to leave the command post. They ran down the ridge toward the jeeps parked below. Behind them, the first North Korean tank crested the ridge. Its main gun fired. The shell hit the abandoned command post and destroyed it. More tanks appeared on the ridgeline. They did not pursue. They stopped and continued firing at the retreating Americans. Smith reached the jeeps and climbed in. The driver started the engine and accelerated south. Smith looked back. Men were running down the road. Some helped wounded comrades. Others ran alone. The tanks on the ridge kept firing. Smith saw shells land among the retreating soldiers. Men fell. Some got back up. Some did not. Private Jaceman ran with his squad. He had made it off the ridge. He was 50 yards from the jeeps when a shell landed next to him. Smith saw the explosion, and then Jaceman was gone. The jeep kept moving south. More men climbed onto vehicles or ran on foot. The column retreated in disorder. Smith tried to count how many men were with him. Maybe 300, maybe less. 240 men were still on the ridge or scattered in the fields, dead, wounded, or missing. Smith had held the position for 2 hours, not 6. The tanks had not stopped. The air support had not arrived. The secondary position 1 mile south would not hold any better than the first. Task Force Smith had delayed the North Korean advance by 2 hours. The cost was half his force and all his heavy equipment. The tanks rolled south behind them, unstoppable. Smith sat in the jeep watching his men retreat and knew the truth. Intelligence had been wrong. The plan had been wrong. The weapons had been wrong. Everything had been wrong except the order to fight. And he had followed that order because it was lawful and proper and correct. 2 hours, half his men, and the tanks kept coming. July 5th, 1950, 1600 hours, secondary position 6 miles south of Osan. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith stood beside the road counting men as they arrived. Some came in vehicles, some walked, some helped wounded comrades. Smith counted and recounted. 318 men out of 540, 222 missing, dead, wounded, captured, or scattered. Smith did not know which. The retreat had been chaotic. Units had broken apart. Men had run in different directions. Some were probably still walking south through the hills, trying to find American lines. Major Martin approached. His uniform was torn and covered in dirt, blood on his sleeve from helping a wounded soldier. "Sir, I have casualty reports from the company commanders." Smith took the papers and read them standing beside the road. First Company, 43 confirmed casualties. Second Company, 38. Third Company, 51. Artillery, 22. The numbers were estimates. The real count would be higher once they found everyone. Smith folded the papers and put them in his pocket. His hands were shaking slightly. He put them in his pocket so Martin would not see. "What about equipment?" Smith asked. "All 4 howitzers destroyed or abandoned. Most of the anti-tank weapons expended or lost. We have small arms, and whatever ammunition the men carried. That is all." Smith nodded. Everything heavy had been left on the ridge or destroyed during retreat. Task Force Smith no longer existed as a fighting unit. They were now just 300 exhausted men with rifles. The radio operator called from the jeep. "Sir, Badger 6 wants a situation report." Smith walked to the radio. The operator handed him the microphone. Smith pressed transmit. "Badger 6, this is Task Force Smith actual, over." "Task Force Smith, send your situation, over." Smith looked at the men sitting beside the road, dirty, exhausted, some bandaged, some staring at nothing. He pressed transmit. "Badger 6, we have withdrawn to secondary position 6 miles south of Osan. Current strength 318 personnel. Estimate 222 casualties. All heavy equipment lost. Unit combat ineffective. Request orders, over." There was a long pause. Then, "Task Force Smith, what is status of enemy force, over?" "Enemy continuing south. No significant delay observed. They rolled through our position, over." Another pause. Longer. Then, "Task Force Smith, continue withdrawal south to Pyeongtaek. Rejoin main force. Well done. Out." "Well done." Smith stood holding the microphone. 222 casualties, 2 hours of delay, all equipment lost, and headquarters said well done. He handed the microphone back to the operator and walked away. Martin followed him. "Sir, are you all right?" Smith stopped and looked at Martin. "Get the men ready to move. We are going to Pyeongtaek." "Yes, sir." Smith walked to the edge of the road and stood alone. He thought about Private Jasmine, thought about the explosion during the retreat, thought about the briefing 4 days ago when he had told his men the mission was manageable. Few tanks, nothing they could not handle. He had believed it when he said it. Intelligence had told him to believe it, and Jasmine had believed him. Now Jasmine was dead, and headquarters said well done. July 8th, 1950, Pyeongtaek, Field Hospital. Smith walked between rows of wounded men looking for one name. The hospital was overwhelmed. Men lay on cots and on the ground. Medics moved between them, treating wounds. The smell of blood and antiseptic filled the tent. Smith stopped at the desk where a medic was updating casualty lists. "I'm looking for Private Donald Jasmine, 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry. He was hit during our withdrawal 3 days ago." The medic checked his clipboard and several loose papers. He checked twice. Then he looked up. "Sir, we have no record of that name. He is not here." "He is not at any of the other hospitals in the area." "What does that mean?" "It means he is either still missing or he was killed and his body was not recovered." Smith thanked him and walked outside. The sun was too bright. The air was too warm. Everything felt wrong. He returned to his temporary quarters and sat at a field desk. An envelope sat on the desk with orders from headquarters. He opened it. The orders directed him to submit an after-action report within 24 hours. Smith pulled out paper and began writing. He wrote the date and time and location. He wrote the mission parameters. He wrote the enemy force composition. He wrote the engagement timeline. Task Force Smith engaged North Korean mechanized forces on July 5th at 0800 hours near Osan. Enemy force consisted of approximately 33 T-34 tanks and 3,000 infantry. Task Force Smith occupied prepared defensive positions and engaged enemy with artillery and anti-tank weapons. Smith paused. The words looked clean on paper, professional. They did not capture what had actually happened. They did not explain how men had died in foxholes while he watched through binoculars, how the rockets had bounced off tanks, how headquarters had ordered him to maintain position while his unit was being destroyed. He continued writing. Anti-tank weapons proved ineffective against T-34 frontal armor. Artillery successfully engaged enemy infantry, but could not stop armored advance. Task Force Smith held position for 2 hours before withdrawing under fire. Estimated enemy casualties, 54. American casualties, 222. Smith stopped writing and read what he had written. It was accurate. It was also incomplete. What he had not written was that intelligence had been catastrophically wrong, that the weapons had been inadequate, that headquarters had ordered him to hold an impossible position, that men had died following orders that made no tactical sense. But he could not write those things. After-action reports were supposed to be factual and professional. Complaints would sound like excuses. Blame would sound like avoiding responsibility. So Smith wrote that the mission had delayed the enemy and allowed main force deployment. He wrote that equipment losses were total, but unavoidable. He wrote that men had fought with courage and discipline. Everything he wrote was true. Everything he wrote was also a lie. He finished the report and sealed it in an envelope. Then he sat at the desk and thought about Jasmine's letter, the one Jasmine had written to his mother saying not to worry, the letter that would never be mailed. Smith pulled out his own paper and began writing a letter to his wife. He told her he was safe. He told her the mission had been difficult, but successful. He told her he would write again soon. He did not tell her about the 222 casualties. He did not tell her about watching men die. He did not tell her that he had given an order to hold position, knowing it was futile because headquarters had told him to. He sealed the letter and put it with the after-action report for delivery. 2 envelopes, both containing carefully written lies. November 1950. Tokyo, 8th Army Headquarters. Smith sat across from 3 colonels who comprised a board of inquiry, reviewing Task Force Smith's performance. The room was clean and quiet, far from the mud and blood of Korea. One colonel read from Smith's after-action report. Colonel Smith, you reported that anti-tank weapons were ineffective against North Korean armor. Did you attempt to engage tanks at closer range where penetration might be possible? Yes, sir. Anti-tank teams engaged at ranges as close as 100 yards. Some hits achieved penetration. Most did not. The 2.36-inch rocket launcher was not designed for T-34 armor. Were you aware of the launcher's limitations before engaging? Smith chose his words carefully. Sir, intelligence briefings indicated enemy armor would be light vehicles. The launcher is effective against light armor. We were not told to expect T-34 medium tanks. One of the colonels made a note. Another colonel asked, why did you withdraw after only 2 hours when orders specified holding as long as possible? Sir, the position became untenable. We had sustained 50% casualties. All heavy weapons were destroyed or expended. Enemy tanks had reached our positions. Remaining longer would have resulted in complete loss of the unit with no additional delay to enemy advance. Did you request permission to withdraw? Yes, sir. I recommended withdrawal. Headquarters ordered me to maintain position as long as possible. I maintained position until tactical situation made further defense impossible. The colonels conferred quietly among themselves. Smith sat waiting. Through the window he could see Tokyo. People walking, cars driving, normal life continuing while men died in Korea. The senior colonel spoke. Colonel Smith, the board finds that Task Force Smith performed its mission under difficult circumstances. The delay achieved allowed main force deployment to proceed. Casualties were regrettable, but within acceptable parameters for the tactical situation. No fault is assigned to your command. You are commended for leadership under fire. Acceptable parameters. Smith heard the phrase and understood what it meant. The casualties had been expected. The mission had been designed knowing men would die. Headquarters had sent 540 men with inadequate weapons against overwhelming force and called the result acceptable. The board dismissed him. Smith saluted and left the room. He walked through the headquarters building and out into the Tokyo street. The sun was bright. People were shopping. Children were playing. Nobody here knew what acceptable parameters meant. Smith stood on the street corner and thought about Private Jasmine, 19 years old, from Nebraska. Wrote his mother every week, dead at Osen because intelligence said there would be a few light tanks and there were 33 T-34s instead. Was Jasmine within acceptable parameters? Were all 222 casualties acceptable? The board said yes. Smith did not know how to argue with that, so he walked back to his quarters and did not argue at all. July 1965. Fort Benning, Georgia. Late night. Charles Smith sat alone in the study of his base housing quarters. The house was dark except for the desk lamp. His wife and children were asleep. Outside, crickets made their summer noise. Inside, Smith sat at the desk with a drawer open. He had not slept well in 15 years, since Korea. His wife knew he had nightmares, but she did not ask about them anymore. She had learned that he would not talk about it. Earlier that evening, his grandson had visited, 8 years old, curious. The boy had seen Smith's uniform hanging in the closet and asked questions. "Grandpa, were you in a war?" "Yes." "Were you a hero?" Smith had not known how to answer that. His daughter had interrupted. "Of course he was. Grandpa won medals." The boy had looked impressed. Smith had said nothing. Now, alone in the study, Smith reached into the drawer and pulled out a paper. It was old, 15 years old. The paper was brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was his own. It was the original casualty list from Task Force Smith, handwritten on July 5th, 1950, 6 hours after the battle, before the official report, before the inquiry, before acceptable parameters, 222 names. Smith had kept the list, had moved it from quarters to quarters for 15 years, never showed his wife, never told anyone it existed. He unfolded the paper carefully and spread it on the desk. His hands were steadier now than they had been in 1950, but the shake was still there, always there. He read down the list, names he had memorized years ago, names he saw when he closed his eyes, names he heard when the house was quiet. He stopped at one name, Jasmine Donald, private, age 19, Nebraska. Smith remembered Jasmine's face at the briefing, confident, trusting. Jasmine had believed what Smith told him. Few tanks, nothing we cannot handle. Smith remembered the explosion during the retreat. One moment Jasmine was running, the next moment he was gone. Smith folded the list and started to put it back in the drawer, then stopped. He unfolded it again and looked at all 222 names. Acceptable parameters. The board had said it. The reports had documented it. The Army had moved on from it. But Smith had not moved on. He kept the list, looked at it maybe once a year, sometimes more. Needed to remember that acceptable parameters had names, had faces, had mothers who never got the letters saying not to worry. His wife appeared in the doorway. She was wearing her robe. "Charles, it is past midnight. Come to bed." Smith looked at her. She was concerned. She had been concerned for 15 years. "In a minute." She looked at the paper on his desk but did not ask what it was. She had learned not to ask. "Do not stay up too long." "I will not." She left. Smith heard her footsteps fade down the hall, heard the bedroom door close. He was alone again. He looked at the list one more time. 222 names. Jasmine, Donald, and 221 others. "Were you a hero, Grandpa?" Smith did not know how to answer that question. He had followed orders. Men had died. The mission had been called successful. He had been commended. But he kept this list in his desk, looked at it in the middle of the night when everyone else was sleeping. Carried it with him for 15 years. Heroes did not do that. Heroes slept peacefully. Heroes felt pride when their grandsons asked questions. Smith folded the list carefully and put it back in the drawer. He turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark. Outside, the crickets continued their noise. Inside, Smith sat alone, thinking about acceptable parameters and whether 19 years old from Nebraska fit within them. He did not go to bed. He sat there until dawn, like he did every year on July 5th, and would continue doing until he no longer could. The list stayed in the drawer. The names stayed in his memory. And Smith stayed awake in the dark.